The Galactic Assembly had ruled the stars for so long that fear had become a forgotten emotion, replaced by routine, ceremony, and a quiet certainty that every species eventually learned its place, and humanity, young and fierce-eyed, was considered no different, just another industrious people welded into the machine of galactic power through treaties written in elegant language but enforced by fleets, quotas, and unspoken threats. Humans had arrived as explorers and traders, earning respect through speed, innovation, and stubborn survival, but respect within the rules quickly hardened into expectation, then obligation, as their ships were folded into alien battle lines, their minerals tagged for extraction, their colonies labeled as strategic assets rather than homes. All justified by ancient accords humanity signed while still believing cooperation could replace dominance. For decades they paid in steel and fire, sending their soldiers to wars they did not begin, guarding borders that were never theirs, rebuilding devastated worlds that would never thank them, while their own protests were buried beneath legal clauses and diplomatic smiles that framed sacrifice as privilege and obedience as stability. Inside the vast circular chamber of the assembly, alien delegates reclined in gravity thrones shaped for bodies that had never starved and minds that had never doubted victory, while the human delegation stood without such luxuries, their posture straight not from reverence but from discipline learned on distant battlefields and industrial decks where hesitation meant death. The final demand was delivered with board efficiency, a new treaty revision requiring permanent human conscription quotas, exclusive resource rights over 3 frontier systems, and unrestricted transit authority through Earth's defensive perimeter, framed as necessary adjustments for galactic security. Though every being present understood it was simply control shedding its final layer of polite disguise. The chamber murmured with detached approval as systems of compliance adjusted in real time, projection screens calculating human output like inventory, not lives, while the human representatives exchanged brief glances heavy with everything they had lost and everything they had quietly prepared, expressions unreadable to species who mistook silence for submission. When the human ambassador requested time to consult their government, the refusal came instantly, crisp and absolute, backed by the slow, deliberate forward drift of an alien war platform on the nearest tactical display, an unsubtle reminder that discussion was an illusion offered only when outcomes were already decided. Laughter rolled through the chamber from throats shaped for mockery and confidence, not because the request was foolish, but because the denial felt effortless. And in that laughter the council revealed the depth of its miscalculation, mistaking endurance for weakness and restraint for incapacity. The ambassador did not argue, did not threaten, did not plead, but raised a single hand in the old human signal of procedural objection, triggering the ancient withdrawal protocols every signatory technically possessed but no one believed any subordinate species would ever dare invoke. Around the hall, alien delegates leaned forward for the first time in centuries as status lights shifted from cooperative blue to neutral gray beside the human insignia, a subtle change most dismissed as symbolic theater, unaware that across the stars automated systems were already unlocking, redirecting, and severing connections forged over 100 years. Human naval task groups embedded within joint fleets received silent priority directives, slipping from formation without broadcast or warning, while supply ships altered course with mathematical precision, flows of ammunition, fuel, and rations evaporating from alien campaign networks in less time than it took for the Council to realize something irreversible had begun. Trade corps blinked with cascading alerts as human logistics hubs disconnected from shared systems one after another, each detachment legally immaculate, every exit executed within the exact boundaries the Council itself had defined long ago as harmless diplomatic safeguards. The human delegation rose together with no order spoken and no signal given, chairs untouched, papers left behind, eyes forward, the sound of their boots on the polished floor slicing through the chamber's growing uncertainty with measured finality. Some delegates scoffed, some bristled, a few felt a disturbance they did not yet understand, but none moved to stop them, because no precedent existed for stopping a species that chose to leave rather than beg. At the threshold of the chamber, the human ambassador paused once, turned back to face the assembly that had banked on their obedience, and spoke a single sentence that carried no anger, only conclusion, stating that all treaties were now void. In that instant, The Galactic Council watched in confusion rather than fear, still believing laws could outrun will and fleets could replace leverage, unaware that the age of controlled humanity had just ended, and that the galaxy had finally pushed its most dangerous species past the point of participation and into something far less predictable. The silence after the declaration lasted less than a heartbeat, yet it cracked through the chamber harder than any weapon discharge, because every system tied to human infrastructure had already begun detaching with cold mechanical obedience, obeying commands issued far beyond the reach of the Assembly's authority. Status grids flared across the Council's tactical sphere as joint fleets reported sudden formation instability, human cruisers peeling away from protective screens with flawless synchronicity, their drives igniting without ceremony as they slipped into autonomous vectors that no longer answered to alien command hierarchies. Supply manifests collapsed first, munitions tallies dropping to zero in active war zones as automated depots locked under human encryption, fuel convoys rerouting mid-transit, life support components expiring inside alien transports that had never learned to stock redundancy without humanity maintaining the margins. Delegates shouted over one another in rising confusion, flooding command channels with override demands that met only denial codes written in the Council's own ancient legal language, the kind designed centuries earlier to reassure minor species that withdrawal was always possible, a clause never meant to be tested. The human delegation crossed the outer ring of the Assembly without acceleration or hesitation, their movement steady and unbroken as the exits unfolded ahead of them, the architecture itself still honoring protocols long after the political will behind them had disappeared. A faction of senior council members attempted to seize the moment with threats of sanctions, embargoes, and extermination rulings, their voices amplified across every relay tied to the chamber, yet even as the words echoed, the machinery that enforced those declarations was already unraveling piece by piece. Border sentry networks reported human command signatures vanishing from shared defense grids, leaving defense arcs hollow where humanity once anchored them, forcing automated recalculations that revealed the terrifying truth that entire regions of space had been fortified backwards, relying on the assumption that human response time would cover alien strategic limitations. On the far edges of Council territory, client species felt the change before they understood it, watching human patrol signals blink out of contested systems where piracy, insurgency, and war had always been held at bay by human presence, the sudden absence more frightening than open invasion. The first economic shockwave struck less than 2 minutes after the exit, when the cross-spindle trade junction lost power as its human-operated reactors disengaged, freezing shipping lanes that fed 12 major star nations and sending raw resource prices into uncontrollable freefall across the interstellar markets. Inside the Assembly, disbelief gave way to urgency as logistics ministers realized their predictive models no longer converged on any stable outcome, every future projection fracturing into catastrophic divergence because one constant variable had simply removed itself from the equation. A strike order was drafted in desperation, targeting human fleet elements still within Council-controlled navigation lanes, but execution failed at the command layer when targeting systems rejected authorization keys that no longer carried joint status clearance. For the first time in recorded galactic history, a unified military network stood armed, powered, and paralyzed, its coordination dependency suddenly exposed as human-coded architecture refused to translate alien intent into action. The human ambassador's final transmission reached every open channel moments after the delegation cleared the chamber, not amplified, not dramatized, but output with precise routing discipline across legal, civilian, and military bands alike, ensuring no authority could later claim misunderstanding. The message contained no declaration of war, no accusation, no demand, only a confirmation that cooperative frameworks had ended and that any further interaction would now occur under independent sovereignty, stripping the Council of its greatest weapon, the ability to define conflict on its own terms. Across the Assembly, the weight of consequence settled unevenly, some species gripped by anger, others by fear, and a few by quiet realization that the hierarchy sustaining their dominance had rested on borrowed hands for far longer than anyone was prepared to admit. Far from the chamber, human task force groups completed their disengagement sequences with immaculate timing, every squadron entering dark transit spacing without collision or delay, vanishing from shared operational space as if they had never been there at all. Only then did the truth settle fully into the minds of the assembled powers. The walkout had not been performance or protest, but extraction, total and irrevocable, leaving behind a galactic order that still stood on paper yet had lost the structure that made it real. The Council's response came wrapped in fury and certainty, a punishment doctrine refined over millennia and used against dozens of defiant species who had all folded once precision annihilation began, and this time the target was singular, isolated, and assumed to be unprepared, Earth. A retaliatory armada was assembled in record time, drawn from the nearest Council war reserves, its commanders convinced they were about to demonstrate order being restored through force, confident that humanity's withdrawal meant fragmentation rather than consolidation. The first probes entered Sol expecting scattered resistance and incomplete defensive coordination, but they encountered structured kill zones layered so tightly that their sensor returns collapsed into static as gravitic compression fields tore the drones into plasma before a single transmission cycle could complete. The advance fleet did not slow, mistaking silence for weakness, and pushed forward in mass formation, activating shield curtains rated to withstand planetary bombardment, only to discover that Earth's outer defenses were not designed around attrition but interception at impossible ranges. Kinetic lances erupted from lunar platforms long believed to be civilian infrastructure, each strike punching through multiple hulls before dissipating, slashing corridors of destruction through the armada with clinical repetition that shattered any illusion of a probing engagement. Council commanders attempted to adapt by dispersing formations, but autonomous human targeting systems recalculated instantly, shifting from corridor annihilation to distributed lethality, turning the three-dimensional theater into a layered execution field where no vector offered concealment. Within minutes, the Council's vanguard lost coherence as Concuil ships ruptured under concentrated fire that ignored shields altogether, tearing directly into reactor cores with mass drivers firing projectiles at relativistic thresholds the Council had outlawed centuries earlier as destabilizing to battlefield balance. Emergency reinforcements were ordered, yet hyperspace gates refused their arrival, registering the same neutral authorization state that now haunted every Council command system, because the navigation lattice guiding their rapid deployment had been human-maintained from its inception. At Earth's orbital boundary, the last surviving Council dread attempted a point defense saturation burn toward the planetary surface, convinced that even a failed strike would signal inevitability, but it never crossed the final defensive layer, detonating in fragments so thoroughly erased that even radiation ghosts failed to linger. The galaxy watched the telemetry cascade outward as the entire assault force vanished from tactical maps in under 8 minutes, a timeline so brief it forced alien analysts to question whether the data stream itself was corrupt rather than accept that a young species had erased a sanctioned Council armada without deploying a visible fleet. Only after the destruction completed did humanity's counterdirective activate, not toward the Council's core worlds, but against the peripheral war factories that supplied its client conflicts, targeting infrastructure rather than population, collapsing production nodes with surgical orbital strikes that dismantled entire military economies overnight. Council-aligned battle groups stationed in distant systems attempted to rally, but their command cohesion fractured as uncertainty spread faster than orders, and several units hesitated long enough for long-range human interdiction assets to arrive unseen and end the engagement before it properly began. Every engagement revealed a consistent pattern the Council had never prepared for. Humanity did not seek territorial pressure, negotiated escalation, or proportional retaliation, but applied decisive force exactly where it nullified future threat potential rather than satisfying immediate vengeance. In emergency conclaves convened across surviving Council space, analysts uncovered the buried truth that every joint war doctrine, every efficiency model, every rapid reaction strategy had been built with the assumption of human logistical superiority quietly closing gaps alien engineering could not bridge. Those same systems, now stripped of that invisible reinforcement, collapsed into inefficiency, then paralysis, exposing how deeply dependent the Council had become on a species it had never considered an equal. For the first time since its formation, the Council faced a conflict where it could not dictate tempo, opponent behavior, or escalation boundaries, because the species now opposing it had never needed permission to build the tools it was finally allowed to use. Across human-controlled space, mobilization surged with precision rather than haste. Fleets emerging from shipyards the Council had never catalogued, commanders operating under doctrines freed from all previous cooperative limitations, and an entire civilization shifting from constrained participation into unrestricted defense posture. The war that followed would no longer be one of correction or compliance, but of structural collapse, and the Council, watching its outer military lattice disintegrate in silence, began to understand that it had not triggered rebellion, but released a power it had spent a century unknowingly constructing. Human fleets did not arrive as a single wave, but as a sequence of impossibilities, each emergence timed to strike before the previous shock had fully registered, forcing Council defenses to respond blindly to threats that never repeated their approach twice. Out of deep transit corridors once catalogued as inactive drift zones, vast formations translated into real space without energy flares, their mass detected only after they were already within decisive range, revealing that humanity had weaponized stealth at scales the Council believed physically unattainable. The first targets were not capital worlds, but the invisible spine of Imperial control, ship lattice forges, hyperspace relay nexuses, and the arbitration vaults that synchronized Council authority across dozens of species, all hit simultaneously with pinpoint gravity shear strikes that folded interior structures into themselves without surface detonation. Entire manufacturing moons vanished from production tallies in seconds, their assembly frames torn inward by localized mass inversion, leaving behind intact shells drifting in silence, technologically alive but functionally dead, as if the heart of each structure had been surgically removed. Council response fleets attempted mass interception, deploying layered interception screens in geometric formations perfected through centuries of dominance warfare, yet human commanders ignored direct challenge entirely, redirecting strikes through micro-transits that bypassed engagement envelopes and attacked from vectors no predictive model had calculated as necessary to defend. In system after system, alien battle groups collapsed without achieving weapons lock, their sensors overwhelmed by cascading decoy constellations, false drive echoes, and gravitational distortions that fractured target acquisition into useless noise while human rail platforms fired from beyond theoretical engagement distance. Veteran Council admirals ordered pursuit despite the chaos, convinced that pressure would expose humanity's limits, only to discover that every human vessel operated with autonomous tactical authority, allowing entire formations to fragment, reassemble, and flank without centralized command delay. Where Council fleets depended on broadcast synchronization, human formations behaved like swarms of independent predators, converging only at the moment of impact, then dissolving again into untraceable dispersion patterns that left no stable retaliatory target. Key gates between Council-controlled sectors fell next, not through bombardment, but through internal cascade sabotage initiated by human infiltration nodes embedded decades earlier beneath treaty engineering exchanges, activated only now when withdrawal codes unlocked restrictions long assumed permanent. Trade corridors collapsed into isolated pockets, turning Imperial supply lines into stranded fragments unable to support sustained defense, while human strike groups advanced freely through routes the Council could no longer coordinate. Client species revolted as choke point protection failed, planetary governors discovering that tribute enforcement fleets were no longer arriving, and in the sudden vacuum of coercion, centuries of suppressed autonomy erupted across dozens of systems at once. Human transmissions reached these worlds only after the upheaval began, offering nothing but confirmation that no new master would replace the old, and that any world choosing independence would find no human fleet arriving to tax, occupy, or command. At the heart of Council territory, emergency mobilization reserves finally deployed in full, assembling a defensive perimeter around the core worlds thick enough to amass any historical assault, yet the timing was already wrong, because humanity no longer fought for access, but for collapse. Rather than breach the wall directly, human forces struck the surrounding stabilizer systems that regulated energy distribution into the core, draining the megastructures that powered defensive grids until shields flickered and disengaged under their own safety thresholds. Within a single rotation cycle, the core world stood exposed behind fleets that could still fight but no longer coordinate, no longer resupply, and no longer assume that time favored their endurance. Across surviving Council channels, fear replaced protocol as emergency directives contradicted one another faster than they could be executed, while human fleets did not accelerate their assault pace at all, maintaining a measured advance that communicated something far more unsettling than haste. Humanity was no longer reacting. Humanity was executing a resolution already decided. And the galaxy, watching the architecture of absolute control fold inward from its outermost supports to its hidden center, began to understand that this war was not about victory over the Council's forces, but the erasure of the system that made those forces possible. The surrender request arrived encoded in protocols older than most Council species, transmitted through surviving neutral relays after every military contingency failed to restore control, and for the first time in its reminder history, the Council spoke not as an authority issuing terms, but as a structure asking to be allowed to continue existing. Human Command received it without interruption to ongoing operations, logged its contents, verified authenticity, and returned a reply so brief it destabilized the negotiation framework built to contain it, stating that there would be no new treaties, no restored privileges, and no permanent hierarchy permitted to reform under a different name. The final advance did not target populations or sacred capitals, only the legal and administrative cores that stored sovereign enforcement authority, the endless archives of binding compulsion that had dictated war quotas, tribute ratios, and population compliance for tens of thousands of years. Council law hubs were dismantled with surgical precision, their planetary-scale data vaults emptied through controlled extraction pulses that stripped coercive frameworks while preserving cultural records, histories, and civil systems untouched, severing the machinery of domination without attempting to erase the civilizations trapped beneath it. Without central authority, imperial fleets either powered down or fragmented into unaffiliated groups, some retreating to defend home systems, others dissolving entirely as crews refused to continue fighting for a structure that could no longer enforce obedience or reward loyalty. Across former Council space, client species hesitated at first, conditioned by generations of suppression to expect punishment for autonomy. But as days passed without reprisal and human fleets remained absent from their skies, caution transformed into self-directed governance with an urgency born from sudden freedom. Human broadcasts followed only after stability began to emerge, carrying no conquest claims, no territorial announcements, and no ideological conversion campaigns, only a universal declaration that civilization would henceforth be measured by consent rather than control, and that humanity would neither rule nor rescue those who chose to rebuild on their own terms. The last surviving Council delegates gathered in a reduced chamber whose boundaries once defined the known order of the galaxy, now stripped of enforcement authority and reduced to advisory status by default rather than decree, their dominance dissolved not through occupation but through irrelevance. When one among them demanded to know what humanity intended to become in the vacuum it had created, the answer returned without ceremony, explaining that humans did not seek to replace a system built on submission, nor to inherit a throne sustained by fear, but to exist without artificial limits imposed by ancient arrogance. Military historians across the galaxy documented the collapse not as a rebellion, nor a war of expansion, but as a structural failure triggered when a foundational species withdrew the silent support that had upheld an entire power architecture beyond its own capacity. Trade eventually resumed through new frameworks shaped by independent treaties rather than enforced quotas, shared defense arose through mutual threat rather than imperial decree, and for the first time since recorded history began, the galaxy learned to function without a singular ruling authority defining survival. On Earth, there were no victory parades mandated by law, no imperial monuments raised to mark the end of the Council, only quiet acknowledgement across cities, colonies, and fleets that the era of constraint had ended without requiring humanity to become what it had just destroyed. Future generations of alien scholars would teach the moment as the walkout, not because it shattered the Council in one motion, but because it revealed a truth every empire feared yet depended upon, that its power existed only so long as those beneath it agreed to remain. Humanity would never again sign a treaty that denied its right to refuse, never again embed its strength into systems designed to exploit it, and never again permit universal order to be mistaken for universal justice. Long after the Council's name faded into academic terminology, one phrase would endure across cultures that once viewed humans as tools, mercenaries, or expendable assets. They were not the strongest species. They were simply the last species anyone ever attempted to bind.